All right, let's just jump right on into chapter 21. So this will be World War One and its aftermath. So the first thing is that the war, when it began, it really kind of suppressed and stopped the progressivism that had been taking place prior to the war. And it kind of did so through some repressive measures. It really kind of instilled a sense of national pride, while at the same time kind of fueling the disillusionment that had already started to shatter the hopes for a modern world during the progressive era. So a lot of the things that people really hoped would happen during the progressive era, by the time the war started, it was like, okay, this is not going to happen, nothing to see here. Furthermore, World War One did lay the foundation for some future things like the Great Depression, World War Two, and it also kind of stoked the fires for some of the ongoing feuds between nationality, religion, culture, not just here in America, but really worldwide. Okay, so how does World War One kind of take off? You definitely have, I sent you a couple of videos. You guys are going to check those out and it'll get into a little bit more detail. But just as a quick overview, when Germany began to rise, the three superpowers at the time, Britain, Russia, and France, did not particularly care for some of what Germany was doing in their rise. So they formed what's called the Triple Entente. Okay, so those three. The Ottoman Empire also was on the sidelines eyeballing some of the Turkish lands along the Austrian-Hungary southern border. Well, this became a problem because, first of all, Russia had already kind of had its eyes on some land in that area to kind of push through some of their agendas and what they were trying to do. But it, especially in the Ottoman Empire. So Russia was actually kind of eyeballing the Ottoman Empire, while the Ottoman Empire is eyeballing land, right there at the border of the Austria-Hungary border. So everybody's looking at each other's land, just coveting. So what ends up happening, also Russia saw itself kind of as the protector and big brother of Slavic lands anyway. So when the Serbians, a group of Serbian men assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, they were the heirs to the Austria-Hungary Empire, to that throne. This was seen kind of as the perfect time by the Austrians to say, we're going to get rid of these Serbians. So, let's start some ethnic cleansing here. So that was their kind of trigger or ticket to justify going through and, based on ethnicity, trying to eradicate the Serbians, okay? When we talk about America, they still hadn't gotten involved in what was happening in Europe because, again, the foreign policy was always to maintain neutrality, right? So at the time, we had also built up a pretty good navy, but we hadn't developed much in any of the other military branches. So it was like, we're not going to really jump into this war. We don't have large armies and, things like that, like the other countries like Great Britain and Russia, etc. So I definitely want you to take notes on things like the Davis Act, the Naval Act, and the National Defense Act, because those things are going to play key roles in how we continue to develop the military. You also had the kind of weaponization of motor vehicles. So this made things a little easier moving things across, terrain, not just along train tracks, because you were limited moving large groups of people or supplies on land. You were limited to just the way that the railroads were already set up. Well, this actually, now you can, when I say weaponize motorized vehicles, well, you can make tanks and big trucks and armored cars and different things like that. So that really came into effect to help with the war efforts. Also check out how the Mexican Revolution played a part in testing America's new military. So even as we began to get, start fledglingly building up some of our military apparatus, well, Mexico gave us a test. So check that out. You also want to make sure you understand why America eventually chose the side of Great Britain, because again, even though we were claiming neutrality, we did eventually pick a side. We also want to make sure you are able to discuss the blank check that Germany kind of gave to Austria-Hungary. Why and what were, what was the outcome of that? Why did Russia begin to mobilize its army? So there's some information there. You want to take a look at that. Russia had the largest army, of course, at that time. At that time period, they were a military force to be reckoned with. Okay, but you also want to know what was the Schlieffen plan and how did it move Europe closer to the war. All right, you want to be able to define levée en masse. Okay, levée en masse. You want to make sure you understand what that is and why it was significant. What were the peripheral campaigns against the Ottoman Empire? We looked at some things happening in Turkey, at Gallipoli, throughout the Middle East, and in various parts of Africa. So let's take a look at that. We want to be able to discuss the fall of Russia, their withdrawal from the war. They ended up ceding lands to Germany. Take a look at the Bolsheviks revolution, Vladimir Lenin, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I'm going to say it like that, Litovsk. So Germany's Arthur Zimmerman, this is another piece this is another thing that ended up kind of hooking America and bringing us on into the war. So before we had joined or anything, Germany's Arthur Zimmerman, he made an offer by telegram to the Mexican government, basically offering them support in exchange for keeping America engaged, during, like, keeping us from getting into the war. Because if we were dealing with them, dealing with Mexico, we wouldn't be, kind of jumping into the European war, which is what Germany wanted to have happen. They did not want America to join in. So this really angered America. So make sure you understand what's going on with that. Also, a couple of things. The sinking of the ship, the Lusitania, and then the Zimmerman telegram. By the time you got to all that, America just said, you know what? Tag me in, coach. We're getting into this fight. So on April 4th of 1917, we officially joined the war. Okay. Now, when we talk about getting people in the military, up until this point, we had largely or solely, used volunteerism. So people wanting to join the military. Well, this is going to be a little bit of a problem because, again, we talked about some of the things that were from the progressive movement. A lot of folks were had kind of some anti-government sentiment going on. There was, anti-imperialism, and people just really weren't sold on, wholly that we should have gotten into the war. So you weren't getting the volunteers to join the military they'd hoped. So they instituted what's called the draft. So now you're having young men between, they're in their youthful ages, so I think it was 17 to 30, I believe. Double check that. Having them, sign up for duty so they could be drafted into the war. All right. Also be able to discuss Robert Yerkes and his contributions to eugenics and education. Make sure you're able to define what eugenics is and who it was targeted against. Okay. Also be able to discuss Buck versus Bell and the entire eugenics movement. We're going to definitely get into a little bit of Margaret Sanger, etc. Make sure you look at W.E.B. Du Bois and some of the other black leaders when it comes to World War I, because, what did they believe? What were they hoping for by getting black men to join into join the military? What were some of their hopes and dreams? And, did it come to fruition? We do know that the War Department did bar blacks from combat during this time. So, there was also, just kind of as people were moving and going, both black and white soldiers, traveling abroad, getting out of America, getting to see other ways of doing things, other, life outside of, your ethnic community or your area. You get to see the world in a larger scope. So to kind of combat you not coming back with some different ideas, The U.S. did try to exercise a lot of social control over the soldiers abroad by offering different educational, religious, and wholesome activities. So make sure you're familiar with what some of those are. What roles did women play in the war, and how did race influence their opportunities? So we definitely want to talk about what the women were doing, both black and white. Then the initiative for, making the world safe for democracy. So that was really a propaganda hit piece that was put out with Wilson. So a couple of things. One, in order to get some more financial support for the war and the war effort, there was the Liberty Loan Drive. So make sure you're familiar with what that is. Also, the use of Hollywood to push its pro-war propaganda under George Creel and the Committee on Public Information, also known as the Creel Committee. Okay. Wilson signed the Espionage Act in 1917 and then the Sedition Act in 1918, stripping dissenters and protesters, of their rights, basically, to publicly resist the war. So once again, as we talked about during class, it's okay to have freedom of speech as long as what you're saying is in line with what the government wants you to say. So this is very, very important. So look at what those two acts did. Also, the American Protective League and J. Edgar Hoover. Okay. American strategy of deploying the convoy. So once we got into the war, we did come up, we got some good ideas on how to fight, right? So putting out the convoys that really helped to tip things, from Germany to the favor of the Allies, because the Germans were, one of their key attacks was on, as ships were moving, being able to torpedo them and sink them. That was really hampering moving goods, services, supplies, and personnel, from one place to another, across the waters. Well, now with the use of the convoy, that really undermined the German efforts there. Okay. Be able to talk about Kaiser Wilhelm II after he abdicated, which he did at the request of the German military leaders. We had a new they had a new democratic government which agreed to an armistice back on and it's funny because it's called 11-11-11. So at 11 a.m. on November 11th in 1918. You also want to be familiar with the 14 points from Wilson. Okay, the 14 points. The war brought an abrupt end to four great European imperial powers. This is very significant because it really does redraw the maps, or of the day, because you just eradicated four of the superpowers. So that got rid of the Germans, basically the Russians, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottoman empires. So you brought down four major, powers with the World War I. You want to also be familiar with the Treaty of Versailles. Let's see here. I just talked a little bit about that. The war transformed the world, especially in the Middle East. Okay, so things really, really changed in the Middle East. So Wilson's King Crane Commission found that most of the inhabitants of the Middle East really wanted to rebuild, their state, independent states free of European control. And that just didn't happen. So at the Treaty of Sevres, at San Remo Conference in 1920, all of that land that was, formerly under the Ottoman Empire, they just start divvying it up between Britain and Russia. They just started, Britain and France. They just start divvying it up. Like, oh, we've taken this over now. The Ottoman Empire is destroyed. So all this land here, we're just going to claim it, and claim it for ourselves, basically. So both Britain and Russia had promised an independent Kurdistan. So all these lies were being told, like, oh, well, don't worry, once the dust settles, we're going to make sure you're an independent state, or you'll be able to have sovereignty in your area. Well, that was never going to happen. Okay, and we know that because when we go back to good old Albert Pike and the letter that may or may not have been written to Manzini, outlining everything, how and why, we see that this was all set up initially so that they could take that land, redistribute it amongst themselves, and set up so that they can create an Israeli state. Okay, so, and we see that already. So, like I said, so that never happened for Kurdistan. The Balfour Declaration of 1917. Now, again, before America even got into the war, right? Just as the war was starting, you had this conference where it was Britain declared support for an independent Israeli home state in Palestine. So this is before you even fought with the Ottomans. This is before, we really engaged, before the war really even started good. There was a declaration saying, yeah, we're going to go ahead and take this land and set it up for, Israel to have an independent nation state. Why is that significant? Because this is 1917. This is a full, almost 30 years before there was even a Hitler in power. So the reason that we were given, and we'll see that a little bit more as we get to World War II. But part of the reason why we felt, we've got to give these poor Jewish people their own, land so that they can be protected from big bad guys like Hitler, who did all these horrible atrocities, during World War II with the concentration camps and the Holocaust, etc. So we were saying, okay, well, that's the reason and the justification for giving this land to this group of people in Palestine. Forget that there are people already living there, but we're going to just go ahead and set that up. Well, that kind of flies in the face of the narrative, because you did this 30 years before there was ever a concentration camp. So, and that's not to undermine or say, I'm not one of those people who say, the Holocaust didn't or didn't. That's not the point here. The Holocaust happening, yes, horrible and everything like that. We definitely know this. However, we use that as the reason to justify, moving these European Jewish people into Palestine, which is going to cause some more problems later on down the road. Kind of where we are today, some of the things that we've got going on today. But anywho, that goes to the Red Scare. So now we start with the Red Scare. Now that World War I is over, Russia, who had been our friends, we don't like Russia anymore. So it kind of sets the stage for that, for Russia to become our enemy, because we are now fearful of communism. So as we talked about just a little bit, as the post-war, the folks in power, is changing, and the new folks coming into power in Russia are very much communist. So, and we fear communism and different things like that. So there were some sneak attacks and all kinds of things. So it also led to America kind of secret intervention in Russia's civil war to oppose the Bolsheviks, who, being very, very communist. Okay. We start seeing race riots. Once, coming back into the United States, we are seeing more race riots. So what's happening is many blacks who didn't go into the military began to move northward, in particular, to work in the factories and the industries to keep America afloat, while many, of our white or European immigrant, citizens were enlisting or being drafted, either way, into the war. So now that they're coming back, the homes, the jobs that they had, abandoned or left to go fight the war, we're now open. We're now occupied by blacks, and so there was a lot of fighting between the ethnic groups and the Black Americans. Now another issue is that for the black men coming back from overseas, because they'd been treated with respect, they saw that just because your skin was white did not mean you were automatically or inherently some type of evil person who hated me because my skin is the color of my skin. So when they started interacting and seeing that in different areas in Europe, that really changed their mindset. So coming back, they were not interested in dealing with Jim Crow. So that was another major issue. So you want to also be very familiar with James Weldon Johnson and his quote about race relations. He gives a very pointed, piece in there, which goes back into some of the things we saw before, like we talked about Black Wall Street and just the destruction of so many black townships, lynching and things like that, because they kind of go hand in hand. World War I did have other far-reaching consequences, including the global depression and World War II. It also led to the Bolshevik Revolution, the creation of the Middle Eastern nations, and kind of exacerbated certain ethnic tensions that we just talked about just here in the United States. The war changed the Americans' kind of perception and position in the world and fueled a very, very nationalistic sentiments. We really started reading our own press clippings, believing, what we were doing was good, going around different parts of the world. So even our anti-imperialist, some folks were kind of sentiments earlier on really started switching and moving to a more pro-government, what we're doing is great. We're making the world safe for democracy. Now, negatively impacting attitudes towards radicalism, dissent, and immigration. Again, so anything that's foreign, anything that's different, anything that's not in lockstep with what the government or the powers that be want pushed, the ideology that they want pushed. If you're outside of that, that's a problem. So people were automatically shunning folks who had been their neighbors and friends before because they didn't wholeheartedly agree with every initiative that was put forth by the government. So again, now if you are speaking against, the wars or anything like that, then it's a problem for you. Post-war disillusionment shattered Americans' optimism for progress, leaving behind kind of a devastated old world and uncertain future about what's going to happen with the U.S. kind of moving forward. So you really did have a lot of uncertainty at that point, okay? Well, that in just a very brief overview is what was going on in chapter 21. We're going to get to chapter 22 here shortly, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.